All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest Tomás Prower, and we're going to start out talking about his book, Queer Magic. I almost got distracted. You have another book I'm very interested in, Morbid Magic, which, if we don't have time to get to today, believe me, I would love to talk about that because, morbid is definitely...
Our two favorite things, being morbid and magic. So kind of covered all the bases here.
Right. So the case of queer magic, I was reading about this, and it seems to be a lot of the history of, queerness throughout the history with deities and heroes and historical figures like your book says, but then it also includes spells and stuff like that. So really, what is the connection that we're getting at here with queer magic?
Queer magic is meant to be essentially a springboard for everything queer in like the mystical community. Mm-hmm. So it has both the history of where queer people were back throughout time, because it's strange when you look into it, having this kind of like, oh, they're not really fully men or they're not really fully women. In a lot of cultures around the world, it was regarded as just, oh, they must be in touch with the divine. They must have some magic powers. They must be magically different somehow. So a lot of queer people throughout history were like shamans, magic workers, spellcasters who could get in touch with that, that je ne sais quoi. And it's just everywhere. So with this book, especially it being a Llewellyn book, it needs some like explicit magic in there for the audience. So it's a mix of history. It goes over what's been happening where throughout history, all over the world. It gives you practical spells, tips, tricks, and stuff that you can do on your own. It also has people from all over the world in the book that I invited to write what it's like being a queer person in this region of the world, in this religion. So you have stories of how some are magic workers and how they use their magic and, living as a Muslim in India. You have people who are queer people living in heavily Confucius-inspired Japan. And it's their stories because it's, look at me. I look straight out of Dublin. So I can't just be writing everyone's story about what it is. I get the facts.
Of course. Right.
I'm half Mexican, but I'm not the United Nations in and of itself. So it's the springboard to just, here's everything, 101. We're going to go through it real fast. Whatever you like, explore on your own. And here's some tips and tricks on how to find more too.
Yeah.
Well, let's start at the beginning because, as soon as you said going back in history, the automatic question that it prompts for me is there a connection between queerness and the occult on a mystical level, or was it forced on them due to them being, for lack of a better word, the first definition of queer in the dictionary? Were they so odd that people forced them into this world, or was there maybe a connection that put them there?
It's both, really, because if you really want to get like down to the psychology of it, mm-hmm. It's the way society perceives you kind of has an effect on your own subconscious and of who you are.
Yeah,
if you have like Mesopotamia, where you have people first coming together to create urban civilization, all these roles in society are brand new. Everyone's just starting out. So everyone's kind of seeing, we don't have to hunt, we don't have to gather anymore. What else do I do with my time? What else am I good at? And people start saying, oh, well, you're different in this way, so maybe it's because of this magical power you have. And then people think, I have a magical power? Maybe I do have a magical power. And then they start exploring that. It's like kids. It's like, you're really good at this. You can do this. And that inspires them to really look into it. So I'm sure a lot of people inherently had it. And those are probably the people that excelled. But sometimes it takes society saying, you're good at this. Or have you looked into this? And they look into it themselves for the first time because they have to be explicitly told by someone else you might not realize.
Right.
So a bit of both.
Right. I see the comparison, not a lot different than racial stereotypes forcing abilities onto people that they're grow up feeling confident in. What were you about to say, Karen?
Well, so just for our listeners, what are some of the cultures we're talking about here? Because I think a lot of people who aren't like queer and grow up in sort of a Western background are going to be really surprised to hear that historically there's any connection between being queer and being spiritual, because like in predominantly Christian culture, it's like, what religion has to say about being queer is that it's bad, basically. But that's obviously not the case everywhere. So
it's not. I mean, even on a brief interlude to that, even in Christianity, it wasn't, because early Christianity, when it was the being thrown in the lion's den, the heavy Roman persecution. When you're that small and you're that beat upon by the man, you take what you can get. So they were not picky on who joined. They weren't going to say, "Oh, here we're this small rabble rousing people starting a new religion. Oh, but your sexuality is like that. We can't accept you right now."
Oh, that
didn't start happening until you get powerful, and when you are powerful, you can kind of start to pick and choose. So
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but but back to it.
It's disturbing that it makes a lot of sense, but it does.
I mean, the answer to every question is, are you in power or are you not in power? And then that defines on how you do your trajectory, especially with queerness. But even inherently in a lot of religions around the world, and when I say a lot, I mean pretty much everything, down from tribal religions in North America, Amazon down in South America. I mean, the book goes over everything. We go through prehistory, we go through all the Middle East, all of Sub-Saharan Africa, all the major religions you heard of, all the religions you kind of heard of, and then just different cultural traditions takes on it. So any place in the world that you can think of, not only is it have some sort of queer history, but it's also in the book, and it's not a voluminous compendium, so it's a little look at everything, but there's stuff out there if you're willing to look and if you're willing to dig. That's the important part.
Yeah. So relating queerness to magic really is something that's sort of ubiquitous throughout history.
It is. It really is. And what's tricky about when looking into queer history, which is also kind of like, eye roll, like, really, is that you have a lot of history that's written, and I won't say like queerness is just fully erased, but it's these weird mental gymnastics that people have to go through, especially like
Sappho and her friend.
Oh my God. Yeah. There was this famous case in back in Victorian Britain when they were uncovering all these Egyptian tombs, and they found this grand one with, two men inside this gilded sarcophagus, and two men were painted all over the sanctum walls and, with their noses together. And, now we look at them, we're like, oh, well, they were probably lovers. And all the art, they're obviously lovers. You know what they said? The official explanation was, oh, these must be conjoined twins.
Oh,
Even though the logic,
they sure are conjoined if you want to.
Yeah, they were 50% right.
But that's the thing. It's a lot of history. It's just, it's there, but it's not fully there. So, I mean, a lot of historical figures were quite queer, and it's just not written about. I mean, you have King Richard the Lionheart, you have many of the samurai of Japan, you have just tons of people, tons of saints. It's just not written.
I would guess that a big part of the reason why is like, if we go back and let's make the comparison to a race. We go back to Black history. Even though it's fragmented by the destruction of a lot of history, there is a linear path. But in the case of queerness, it's a fractured history no matter what, because it affects everybody, but it's not a linear path. Like, my dad was gay, I'm not gay. It's not that way. And so, it probably, because earlier when you were talking about it, you sort of made the joke of rolling your eyes, like people wouldn't take it seriously. And maybe one of those reasons why is because it's fractured throughout history. It's not a linear path.
Yeah, it gets really squiggly. It gets very spaghetti-like, because when you're talking about queerness, it's very difficult, because you can't just For certain people, you can, but you can't to everyone with 100% say, that's a queer person.
Right.
So what is a queer person? And then what is defined as queer, what we call it today, it's not the same thing it was 100 years ago. It's not the same thing it was 200 years ago.
It's not even really the same thing it was like 10 years ago. Like the word queer itself, like even today is like, should we use this for this community? Should we use this for that? So, you know.
Exactly. So imagine millennia of that.
Right.
And then on top of that, this discussion is going on in every single culture. So in every single culture, queerness is different. The debate on what is queerness is different. So it's really hard to get a united front on what is queerness. And in India right now, it's really tricky because they have 3 official genders, male, female, and then this kind of like third gender. In the West, we would consider them transgender women, but it's a whole special
it's
gender
its own thing.
itself.
Yeah.
So when the people are trying to fight for transgender rights, it doesn't include these people. So do you include those people to give them the rights? When you fight for queer rights, are these people included in it? Do they get benefited from it? Do they have special laws? And it's weird because when you deal with the law, everything has to be black and white. There can be no gray in order for judgments to be ruled. The laws have to be written in black and white. So when you have something as nebulous and gray as queerness, and you have to make fundamental black and white decisions on that, interfighting happens. And then that scale multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. What is queerness? What is queerness in this religion, in this cultural context, in this society at this time? And you can't pinpoint it down. So it's fascinating, but it's very spaghetti tricky.
Yeah, that's funny because before we even had this interview, and maybe I should include this for other cis straight people out there like myself, I had to quiz Kara a little bit to make sure that I was right on what I thought queer meant. Because, like a lot of people.
Literally right before the show started, he's okay,
I had already quizzed my wife about it earlier.
What does queer mean, Kara? I'm like, well, that's what the show's about. And then it's like, no, but seriously, I don't want to look like an idiot.
Right. Well, I grew up, and to me, queer was synonymous with gay.
Right.
In the world that I grew up in. It was not synonymous with lesbian, transgender, any of the other. It was specifically gay men that it was synonymous with, to me, in my world of my upbringing. But, obviously that's not the case now, or it wouldn't be included with gay in the letters. So, when we're talking about queer, we're looking at, and this is not me telling you or really asking you, I'm just trying to help the audience understand that we're talking about gender and sexuality outside of what is the norm throughout history. Is that, and I air quoted the norm for anybody who's not watching. But that's pretty much what we're getting at here. And correct me if I'm wrong, of course, before I go on.
No, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, even if I say like, this is what queer is, it's really just my idea of it, because even nowadays, I mean, you have people who read queer magic and it's like, that's offensive. That's a slur. Well, it is a slur. I mean, it is. I mean, if some very straight man looked at me and was like queer, he did not mean that in a friendly way. He did not mean that in a friendly way.
No, unless he was some sort of 1800s British investigator, and he was
queer,
acknowledging a clue. He's all very queer.
Yes, where were you on the night of the 21st?
Right.
Don't leave the hotel until we have this sorted.
Exactly. I mean, everything depends on who says it, how they say it, why they say it. The way I do it is, when people come to you and they honestly have a question and it might be offensive, I might be the only person that they're like, I need to ask this question. Like when you need to ask medical questions online because you don't want to ask people. So you like look it up and it's like, is this it? Those anonymous doctor questions.
Sure.
It's a lot of things. Because if you have people who are just really scared to ask questions, they'll never get answers.
Oh, absolutely. I lean heavily on my friends of different genders, races. My wife, who's obviously a woman and I am a man, I have to lean heavily on her for some information on 50% of the damn population. So it's like, absolutely, but it's the friendships and the intentions there. Like, there's no such thing as a bad word. It's just the intentions, Every word, I mean, if you get rid of it, you get rid of the history associated with it.
And that's true. That's true.
In the case of the third gender, this is something I've heard a lot about from Native American tribes. I'm sure it's just some. We kind of suffer from clumping them into one culture when really there were hundreds. But this third gender, it's interesting because, okay, so again, if I get offensive, let's do this. Historically,
we'll execute you summarily, and I'll take over the interview. Yeah. It's fine. Ask me questions.
Historically, gay
Don't
men.
Be scared.
Historically, gay men have been much more prevalent throughout history. One assumption to that could be that men have more power and therefore could get away with it. The other could be that maybe it's more common. Where am I going with this? This third gender, like you're saying, in these other cultures, is there some connection there? And why is that so much more common throughout history of men being the queer?
I think
I'm not wording this very well.
Much.
Yes.
No, I totally get what you mean.
Yeah.
I think you hit it on the head, and it diverts into a couple different things. But I really do think it's about power, because when you have the power, you write the history, and you have, especially when I was looking through like the ancient and the oldest of the old and all these cultures where men really had the power, they're not going to write about women. I mean, because it would be the same to them as writing the history of what that chair did on an everyday. Women were property, straight up. It was
the
just
history of livestock, right?
Yeah, just not even worth being thought of. So a lot of stuff could have happened. It's just that it wasn't recorded, and we don't know about it because we don't know the average life of a chair, back in ancient Greece.
Right.
So that's part of it. But the other thing is that I wouldn't say it's more common, but again, when you're in a position of power, things are more okay. Like when a very wealthy person does something very weird, they're just eccentric. When a poor person does it, they're crazy. So when you have this person, you're in a position of power and you want to fool around, it's okay. You'll justify it. It'll start work its way into the religion. It'll start working its way into the laws. It'll start working its way into different things. And you can be more out and open with it because, if you're the king or you're the ruling class, what's anyone going to say about it,
Right.
So it's a lot more visible because they can afford to be visible because there's not going to be as much backlash of it.
Now, how visible are we talking? As somebody growing up learning about this, a lot of people, at least in my age bracket, people, I'd like to think my kids are a hell of a lot more educated about this stuff than I was. And, my dad didn't even come out until after my mom died, and I was 18. My brother was in his early 20s, although we had some idea prior to that, but he didn't actually come out open about it until my mother had died. So we didn't get quite the education that one might have thought. And so I'm curious, most of us in our first historical education on this was that it was openly accepted in Greece and Rome. But how openly accepted? When we say openly accepted, that makes one think like, oh, you see a couple on the road, there might be two men, there might be two women, there might be a man and a woman. That's openly accepted. We're all fine with it. But how openly accepted are we talking?
It's tricky to answer, which is not a cop-out question, but it's just,
oh no, it's fine. I understand
it's real tricky because back then, even the idea of the idea of queerness, it wasn't something that you were. Like in ancient Greece and Rome, being queerness was a verb. It's what you did. And But especially in ancient Greece,
that makes sense.
The genders were separated. Like, unless they were like eating, the last night dinner and they were going to bed, the genders were separated. Women stayed exclusively with women and men stayed exclusively with men. Sounds and so when that happens, other things start happening.
Right.
And so relationships start feeling, if your entire life is surrounded by men and that's all you know growing up and you only see, a woman when you go home and go to sleep, and you might even be sleeping with them, it's more seen. It's more accepted as okay. And you start having it. What was not okay is that because this is a verb in those times, is that, and this thing still lingers on to today and in cultures all over the world, but if you are the top, that is okay. If you are, the penetrator, if you are the person who is the active partner,
the person
that's okay, because you are dominant.
You're the person perceived as being in power,
Yeah, because it goes back to a lot of misogyny, because if you are the receiving partner, you are a woman, and being a woman, that is what's bad. Yeah. So it's strange.
It's a really interesting comparison, because the world, as a cisgender man who's married, I'm sure a lot of people realize that I may have all the power in the world and stuff like that compared to women and other stuff like that, but when it comes to sexuality in my household, I have none. I'm available. You just tell me when you're ready. That's the way these things tend to work. I don't really have much power in that situation, so it's interesting the way we look at that, or and I realize there's a lot of arguments there about the exercise of power and the taking advantage of people and stuff like that. But for any happily married person out there, we find that to be a little bit humorous, because we're all like, oh, that's not the case now, but hopefully you can see the joke in this. But the normality of it, they would have us believe that part of the coming of age was doing that, I can't tell what I hear is propaganda when it comes to that part of history, the Greeks and the Romans, and what is the reality of the situation. But people would have me believe that it was a coming of age, ritualistic aspect of their lives and everybody's life, at least in the soldier class.
It was to an extent, because we're getting my laptop. I was to an extent, because when you really look into it, they had these relationships, which would not be okay today, but it was seen as mentorship, where an older man would kind of be the mentor, the teacher, the tutor to a younger person, to make them, instruct them in the arts of war, and instruct them in how to be an adult citizen in Greece. But that also involved helping them become a man, sexually. Right. So you had people who would guide these young boys, through what we would consider elementary school up and through high school. And, a lot of changes happen, and they would be the first one, and they would teach you, this is how you make love to a man. It would not be okay today, but back then it was very ritualistic in that sense. Not just the sexuality of it, but because it was part of this entire mentorship acolyte process.
Right. Okay. So it was somewhat normalized, maybe not walking in the streets, but it was normalized in society and something that everybody was aware of. At least during portions of that history, I realized we're looking at, 1,000 years or something. There was ebbing and flowing throughout their culture, I'm sure. So getting back to magic, how much of this carries over to today? Is there I realize that you don't have the statistics to answer this, but would you say that today that there are a larger number of people who have grown up in these, what we're going to call marginalized by the rest of the world, a more connection to the paranormal and the spiritual than others, because most spiritual religious people are going to say that anybody who's queer has no connection. But
well, yeah, I mean, if they're evangelicals or whatever.
well, I would say a lot of religions nowadays, because back then, like Thomas was saying, a lot of these religions were new and starting, but today we don't seem to have a lot of weak religions that people are hearing about. I mean, if you're hearing about it on the news, they've been big and powerful for hundreds, if not thousands of years. That's a good question. Okay, Kara, perfect. What is a big religion today that is okay with this and maybe even glorifies it?
I probably wouldn't say glorifies, but one of the big religions that's really okay with it is well, no, I can't even say that, because if every religion it's in order for religion to be really big, it's had to have existed for a long time. And every religion that has existed for a long time has been fractured in some way, in some denomination.
Right.
So you could say Judaism is, but then you could only say Reformed Judaism is, which is a lot of people, but it's not Judaism. Buddhists are okay with it, but not all branches of Buddhism. Taoism, super okay with it, but then about 50% super aren't. Then you have what kind of Christianity are you talking about? What kind? It's really tricky. If you have if you want to talk about ones that are absolutely okay with it, 100%, you would have to look to the religions created by the African slave trade. The New World kind of African diaspora religions. You're talking about voodoo. You're talking about Santeria. You're talking about Candomblé down in Brazil, and those were and are very, very open and very accepting of queerness. I mean,
interesting,
and their populations are very high percentage queer, and there's a lot of theories on it. But one of the big ones is that the places where those exist, so like Haiti, the Caribbean, Brazil, it is not okay to be a queer person at all. But here's this religion where it's super okay. And so if you grow up in that society, you kind of gravitate towards those religions and want to be in it, if not just because it's an oasis of just being yourself.
Right.
You have the trance rituals and like Santeria and voodoo, where the deities, you invoke them, they come in you, they ride you. And if you are, a cisgender male and you invoke a female deity, you will start acting effeminate. That feminine energy will overpower you, and you'll start doing things as a woman. You'll start acting womanly, and you have to be okay with that. Same thing with women. And it's just this whole idea of gender is this, but it's also not this. And it's very fluid. And to allow the deities to come into you, you have to be okay with that kind of sexuality and expressing that sexuality, because you have to let completely go of who you are, which includes not only your mind and thinking, but the way you perceive yourself sexually, the way you perceive your own gender. You have to completely let go of it all.
Your biases and prejudices and everything. Yeah.
So yeah, those are real, very big 100% we support.
So do we think these religions sort of have evolved that way because the larger society is so accepting, and so they wanted to sort of appeal to people who would be marginalized from the mainstream anyway, or is it sort of
actually
okay? Interesting.
Because if when the slaves were back in slave days, they didn't have much power at all. And again, you talk about early Christianity, where when you're very oppressed and you're very small, you take what you can get. So if you have this, it's just you and the other people on the sugar plantation in Haiti, and you cannot fight amongst yourselves. You cannot divide yourselves. So you just take everyone in, and everyone becomes part of the team, because what's bigger than your sexuality is this real tough struggle you're all in, and you're all in the same position. You're all in the same chains. You're all out there in the fields. And that kind of struggle supersedes the idea of, oh, but you kind of like these kind of people. You're sexually attracted to these people. So it was just the solidarity of, this is who we are.
Okay.
And being accepted.
So it sort of became inclusive because they couldn't afford not to be inclusive, is what you're saying.
It definitely amplified. And even if you go back further, because these religions came from sub-Saharan Africa, it was totally okay in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, these queer deities, this invocation of selves, it was absolutely 100% okay. So it starts off as being okay, in Africa. It gets transported across the Atlantic and here, and you have these small people who's like, look, we have this shared history of our past. We're in it together. It's just us against the man. Why are we fighting amongst ourselves?
Right. Survival is much more important.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Right. Especially during a time when you had to work all day to feed yourself. Now I always make this comparison to say that money is screwed up because, back then one man would work all day to feed himself and his family would work all day to feed themselves. And now one man makes enough milk for 5,000 people. Why are we working all day, toiling all day in a world where that's supposed to be alleviated by technology? But back then you had to work all day to take care of yourself, and you had to work as a group to survive. And so I totally get what you're saying. It's like you have no choice. It's band together or die.
Oh, yeah. Again, and even amplify that, back in the, the Caribbean, where you're not even harvesting your own food. You're harvesting sugar for back in Europe.
Yeah, that's true. Right.
So it's like
double back-breaking. You're surviving and you're paying for their luxuries.
Yeah, it's really tricky. And the probably the most controversial thing about the survival topic in queerness is that why does it even exist at all? I mean, shouldn't it be evolutionary? What purpose does it serve? You can't, naturally reproduce. How does it keep happening? And that's the argument that a lot of some religions have, where it is not natural because it serves no evolutionary purpose. And the argument against that is, well, it has to because it keeps popping up. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist at all. It would have been just wiped by the roadside genetically. And it's one of those things where, and it's done in every religion, even in the pagan queer community, where is this natural or is it not natural? Because when you have the very earth-based religions where everything is based on nature, based on the holiness of how the world naturally is, the argument of, is this natural? And it's really strange when you talk about queerness and being natural because you run into that whole argument. And it's just like,
well, I would say by that argument, even asking if it's natural is unnatural. All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland, and our guest Tomás Prower. We're talking about his new book, Queer Magic, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the history and the queerness of the topic, but not a huge amount of time on the magic. So, when I think of magic, at least, I think of light and dark magic, and maybe that's a little high fantasy of me or something. But, is there a specific type of magic or attitude of magic that queer people throughout history have been associated with? We obviously, right before the break, we talked about conjuring and mediumship, which made a lot of sense when you put it that way, because they have to be able to characterize whoever's coming through without any bias. But, is there an evil associated with it, or a positiveness, or does that change from culture to culture, or is that not really there?
I mean, not only does that change from culture to culture, but even when you talk about what magic is and you get into the fine details of it, everything's up for grabs. But if you want to talk about one thing specific, throughout all the cultures, again, it's being that divine intercessor. It's being the one people who can connect with the other world, which can in a way be light and dark if you say that, they can reach the gods above. They're more in touch with that spirituality. they're in touch with this other dimension of, the heavenly beings, but they're also in touch with the other side of the veil, the underground, the ancestors, the dead, just anything that's in this, what we would say like an other dimension. They can kind of transcend that. They can cross these, boundaries and borders because they're seen as more fluid. They're seen as not one thing, because they're not men, but they're not women. So what are they?
Right.
It's
the way I've heard it explained, and correct me if this is wrong, but it's sort of like queer people throughout history have sort of been seen as being in two categories at once. And so they've sort of been like, okay, that obviously makes you someone who is in a liminal state by your very nature. You're automatically just in multiple categories, and therefore that crosses over to magic too. Is that sort of what the logic was?
It is, because going back to it again, when it's how society sees you, because queer people in everywhere have always been a minority. And when the magical systems, the rules, and how we're going to manifest things start getting into play, majority opinion rules. And so if majority opinion says these people are good at this, that kind of becomes the default accepted norm over 10 years, over a century, over a millennium.
See, what's weird to me, though, is that people who aren't queer, because they are the majority, would sort of choose to give queer people the power in this way. Like, they would choose to elevate people who are not them to high positions in society in many cases, shamans and whatnot, because they're different. That's like, it's very strange.
It's tricky because it's not always a good thing. It depends on where in the world you talk about. Like if you talk about in Siberia, the Chukchi tribe, the queer shamans are the most powerful because they have the power of men and they have the power of women and the power of the unknown, so no one wants to mess with them. But it's I have all this power, but it's also very lonely at the top. A lot of them don't have friends. A lot of them are ostracized because everyone's so scared of their power. So it's like,
that's
we'll
interesting.
you when we need something, but like, don't stay away. So
it's like vampire hunters in Eastern Europe who were thought to be half vampire, and so they were
bring it in
valued for their ability to kill vampires, but also ostracized for their unholy heritage. Yes, got to connect everything to vampires somehow. Thank you. I did it for this episode. I'm good. I did my goal.
That's your one per list.
Yeah, exactly. Check that off.
So, but I'm assuming it's not always so black and white, because if you think about musicians and artists, here's an area where being gay or being queer was maybe a little more outwardly shown. And in certain aspects, they were considered greats. And in other aspects, that very same person might be under the boot heel of somebody in power who belittles them. And that boot heel is accepted by the people around them. Do you get what I'm saying with this? I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but in one aspect of their life, they are glorified. But in the other aspect, they're very much not.
It's true. And again, it's impossible to speak of like generalities with this, but what's real tricky and always like important to remember is that a lot of times when people look back at history or they think back to the past, even the recent past, they look at it from a very modern perspective. So they have like, this is what queer is, and this is like the power struggle. So this is how it must have been, 500 years ago. And the entire way society relates to itself is different. I mean, again, back to ancient Mesopotamia, when you're writing the very first laws in Hammurabi's code, and it's like, okay, everyone, we need to have some sort of structure in how we're going to do this. Nothing about queerness is mentioned. Scholarly research on that says that it's because it was just such a mundane, accepted fact of life that it wouldn't need to be regulated. It was just like, we don't need to talk about it because it's not a big thing.
But the argument could also be made that it was shunned and they didn't want to talk about it.
It's true. And again, it's hard to get pinpoint definitive answers.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have those kind of like discussions and you have those kinds of talks, you have to look at it from not only that perspective, but remember that perspective also wasn't the perspective. It's a weird rabbit hole of like placing your mind outside yourself and in this group, but then you also have to put your mind in this other group that was there. But we only have so much information.
Of course.
Got to do some queer channeling in order to understand the nature of queerness. It's just, you got a chicken or the egg kind of problem. Totally on a different thing.
Go ahead. I'm
on Tumblr a lot. I feel like most of the queer people I know there are witches. Is this becoming like a thing in Western culture? Are queer people more drawn to the occult, or am I in a weird witchy bubble, which I probably am anyway? But
I don't think they're drawn to the occult so much as they're drawn to the punk rock ostracizedness of it. Because if
fair.
You look at the rock community, a lot more accepting. You look in, even the vampire communities,
that's true.
More accepting. All these ostracized groups kind of see another outsider, and it's like, okay, you're one of us. We're all weird. We're all different for different reasons. We don't care.
Right.
We're the outsiders. We're the misfits.
Yeah, that tracks. That makes sense.
And the punk rock comparison, growing up playing in bands in a small town, we would have shows and there would be a punk band, an acoustic act, some ska band, and there would be basically all these small scenes that had no followings would band together, and you would get the craziest eclectic shows that seemed perfectly normal at the time. But if you were going to a larger town where there were these larger scenes, you wouldn't see a hardcore straight edge band playing with a super drunk gutter punk band. But in the small town they would, because who else are you going to play with? Where else are you going to find the venue, and so on and so forth. So that makes sense that the marginalized, I don't even know if that's the best word to use. It's just people band together to create larger groups of safety and security and success.
Yeah. And the other big part of it is that magic is very powerful. Even if you cannot affect magic in the world, having that sense of feeling powerful is very important and very attractive to people who are told they're no good, to people who are said, you have no power, you are evil, you're bad. Suddenly you find this kind of like worldview and this practice system wherein you can not only have power, but you can affect the world around you in a very physical way. And that attracts a lot of people who are, outcasts, a lot of people who are put down by society. Just that sense of finding power again, and witchcraft offers that. So you get all these sites coming in, and the queer minority just fits into all of them.
That's interesting, because in this discussion we've kind of hit a weird split, and that's maybe an interesting point that had happened in history, where historically speaking the odd and the strange were forced into these roles. And then at some point in history, it seems to have switched to a place where the odd and the put outside found safety in these roles. Because it seems to say that at the beginning evolution of this, it was society that saw these people as different and said, whoa, you go there. And now people say, I'm different. Oh, I'm going to go here. And it's like, I don't know. It's an interesting change where maybe there was no change at all. It's just a change of our perspective.
I imagine some self-selection has always happened, but you're right.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, like nowadays in our modern world, we have the luxury where different is good. I mean, if you're going back then, the earliest times, being different, looking different, oh, that was bad in any sort of way. Oh, you have this weird little deformity. Oh, you must be from the devil.
Oh yeah. Hair lip.
This curse on you. Oh, you must be part of this other tribe that we hate. Being different was a liability.
Yeah, hair lip was a sign of like the devil and all sorts of just weird stuff. Yeah, man, we're terrible throughout history. We have just been terrible.
I mean,
but I guess there's some positivity to say that throughout history we have survived and gotten slightly better. So we may not be that terrible. It might just be like a 50.5% versus 49.5%. So we just need a couple more million years and we'll be someplace good as it takes over. But I don't know. Looking back at history definitely makes me think how terrible we are. I mean, looking at the world today, I think we're not so good. But if you look back in history, people were very, very disposable.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
So in the case of growing up in these other cultures today, I'm kind of curious about other countries. So you said that you reached out to other religions. I assume some of those came from other countries. I think we're all aware that there's probably a lot of negativity in those other countries when it comes to this. But are there any really sort of positive ones where we wouldn't expect it to be okay for somebody, and it was? So no.
The hard and fast answer is
getting a little hopeful with that one, Chance. That's a no.
It's a whole weird shift that's kind of happened in the world, and it's really weird to talk about this. So, back in ancient times, a lot of the countries, a lot of the cultures that we would consider nowadays, being very unfriendly, it was reversed. They were the most accepting. They were the most friendly ones. I mean, if you talk about, tough where it's places where it is real tough being a queer person, you talk about nowadays sub-Saharan Africa, you talk about the Middle East, you talk about Polynesia, you talk about all these different places where it's real hard. Those were the real accepting places. In their organic religions, the tribal religions, the native religions, native beliefs, queerness was very accepted. But it wasn't okay in very Christian Europe. Then missionaries came, colonization happened, erased the history, and just like, no, it's bad. So nowadays you have this weird reverse bizarro world where now in Europe and the quote unquote, industrialized nations, it's okay. But in the places where originally wasn't okay, it's not okay, because they're going back on a belief that was taught to them during a time it wasn't okay by people who thought it wasn't okay, though they think it's okay now. And it's just a shift. The places that are not okay now originally were very okay.
So imperialism went in there, dropped their crap on them, and left without updating any of the information.
But it's severe to the point where it boggles your mind, because you have these places, native places defending it's never been okay here. It has never existed here because in the Bible it said it wasn't. But the Bible is a very Middle Eastern kind of book. And so it's weird the mental gymnastics people can play. But Africa, Polynesia, the Middle East, Native America, those were all originally very okay places. Very okay places. Just not so much nowadays.
What names throughout, in your book description, we're talking about heroes and gods throughout history. Let's go with gods. What gods would stick out in your mind as being fitting the criteria of what we're talking about? I'm assuming that in
having some queerness to them.
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious
whatever that
ones
means to
that
us,
are maybe a little bit insulting. There are the obvious ones. There's
Loki.
Hermaphrodite. Hermaphrodite would be one of them. Was a character, was a person, not a god, I don't think. But Loki
was definitely very queer. I mean,
I'm shattered.
You didn't know that? Everyone knows that.
I've seen Tom Hiddleston. I knew that.
Loki is a gender fluid icon. Yeah.
I didn't know much about it. Yeah.
If you look into like the prose and the poetic eddas of it all, where the Icelandic tales of Loki, there's this very famous scene where he's essentially, the plot is that all the gods are calling Loki out for being a weird trickster and like stop it, stop being such a troublemaker. So then his council, they're calling him out, and he's just like, well, look who's talking, and kind of just like goes back on everyone, and essentially gets to Odin and is like, it's interesting how this kind of magic that you can only get via a ceremony where you have to bottom as a woman. That's
Odin too.
So, and Odin's like, so there's a lot of that going on.
That's interesting because I look at Norse mythology. I think a lot of people look at Norse mythology as being like the manliest of mythologies. You know,
I mean, in like we're talking about like Viking era culture of Scandinavia. Oh yeah, being queer was absolutely not okay. Being a woman was absolutely not okay. But the most powerful people were lesbian women, just because of the ratio of women. If you have so many women, because women are so hated in society, that you only have this small number of women you could marry. If she's a lesbian and you marry her, you can't divorce her. And she knows that. And so you have these women going off saying, look, I'm going to have an extramarital affair with this other woman. You are not going to divorce me because what other chance of getting another woman do you got?
Right.
You want to have an heir, you're going to put up with this.
That's amazing.
I mean, whatever works.
Funny.
Whatever works. All right. Well, go ahead. I'm listening.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, like Amaterasu, the sun goddess in Japan. She's a very like self-hating queer deity, but she's very queer, very attracted. Yeah, I mean,
self-hating for being queer or self-hating.
Get Amaterasu some therapy. I mean,
she doesn't like queerness, but she's also very queer, and it's like okay when she does it, but it's not okay when the other gods do it.
Yeah,
kind of a way. Mm-hmm. Very human, very petty.
Right. Amazing how all these gods are so petty.
Surprise, surprise. You have what's his name? You have Krishna in the Hindu cultures, who's was this god of love, among other things, but the pure essence of love, where it doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter your sexuality. I mean, he loves you. He loves you platonically. He loves you romantically. He loves you sexually. He is just love incarnate.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's certain branches within Hinduism, because Hinduism is a spaghetti mess in and of itself, like what the lineation of the gods and what is official. But there's certain religions where you can, a cisgender male can get in touch with the divine by getting in touch with his feminine side. And by getting in touch with his feminine side, especially through Krishna, you can be more attractive to heterosexual women. So it's both a way to get the ladies and a way to get enlightened through the divine. And
that's not that much different than today.
Yeah.
I mean, when I got married, I was a total asshole. You know, I had to become somewhat nicer of a person and understand my feelings before, my wife was willing to put up with me for the 16 years we've been together. So there is some practical knowledge in there as well.
Yeah.
There's
a lot of sense.
There's the Yoruba god of healing, whose name has escaped me right now, which isn't good. I think it's Oshun, or I'll look it up in a second. But what he was about was he was this, very fierce healing deity, very masculine, but he was also the goddess of the rivers, and he would change into a woman. Oh, and because he could understand a woman so much, the female goddess of love married him because, here's a man who understands women. Then she got upset because he also liked men and would go off into the woods with the god of war and start, having jam sessions and play music. And then they developed a relationship, and then he stopped coming to her. And it's this whole kind of Melrose Place drama where things are happening.
That's amazing.
Oh, and there's so much of this.
Yeah. We want him to understand a woman, but not too well. Kind of what she was thinking. Like, I want you to understand a woman, but not too well.
Wait, not like that.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's throughout everywhere. Another one is in the Inuit culture, Sedna, who's the lesbian goddess of death in the sea. And her whole...
like her.
Mm-hmm.
Goth girlfriend.
Her whole thing was she didn't want to marry anybody. She was just not interested in marriage. But, her father really wanted her to get married to continue the line and have babies. So she jokingly married a dog to like, oh, look, Dad, I'm finally getting married. You should be happy. Ha, ha, ha. Well, he got upset and killed her and threw her into, killed her, threw her into the icy sea, and she found a lesbian lover there. So she was like, no, I'm cool. I'm just going to stay down here now. I found someone I love. And her and I are also going to take vengeance upon all of humanity and you by withholding the bounty of the sea if you don't treat me right anymore.
And happy ending.
A happy ending for her. I mean, she's
Yeah,
really
I like
excited
that.
about it. And she controls life and death for the Inuit people up in Alaska and Canada.
Now, in that culture, is that any sort of, I mean, I don't mean to roll to the negative, but I mean, that is the world that we live in here. Is that any vilification of her sexuality, why she was put in that role with that?
No, it was just because she was being a rebellious daughter.
I see.
It wasn't that she was gay. It's just that she wasn't
Getting married.
Yeah, she wasn't following tradition.
I see.
Right.
And that was more important because the family honor, the family shame.
Right. Because I was thinking about that earlier. Like we were talking about how queer people throughout history were put into this role of spiritualization from walking both sides. We're automatically putting the two on them, man, woman, man, woman. And then you were talking about how even today pagans and belief in natural magic would question that. And I assume that there's a lot of belief that they're there because of their unnaturalness, because of their connection to the other side. It's not necessarily the man, woman being both sides, but the fact that this person is being unnatural connects them to the unnaturalness. Does that make sense how I'm putting it?
It does. I get it. I would say it's more, I wasn't say it's a mix that they're both, but it's the fact when you take away labels are very powerful. If you can say this is this and that is that, you can kind of control and understand your world. But if you have this thing that has no label and you cannot pinpoint it, they're not saying they're man, they're not saying they're woman, there's no definition for them in your culture, you can't pinpoint that. And so you can't grasp it, you can't hold it down, and it becomes this nebulous liminal thing. And the other nebulous liminal things you have are like the big questions: death, God, religion, spirituality. So they kind of start falling into that category of things we cannot explain and cannot understand and cannot even put words to, so it must be in the same category.
I'm just imagining like an unexplained podcast, Bigfoot, UFOs, gay people. It's like, it's just.
Well, you're on it.
Which apparently is us now that I realize, because we're doing this topic. But
all right, well, we're coming up at the end of our time here, Thomas. I've really enjoyed this conversation. A lot of insight into the history.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff.
A lot of insight into the current day and age, especially with what's going on in the world. I think it's a time that people are looking for that, looking for some insight into things that they don't understand. So I'm really happy that I had a chance to pick your brain about some of this stuff. I think it's very cool. I would love to have you back on. I'm going to have to edit out the gardener that just came by my door. I'd love to have you back on to talk about Morbid Magic, your other book. I think that's something that Kara and I would totally enjoy talking about.
Absolutely.
And also, I have one request for your next book, and that is the history of queerness in horror films. Horror films is my obsession, and
the Babadook.
Yeah, horror.
I love the Babadook.
One thing that definitely sticks out is the main baddie in Stargate. There's lots of great things on both sides there to pick apart. So that's my horror movie. And then Kara, I'm sure, has something with vampires.
Oh, absolutely. And before we go, one more time, where can people find your new book?
Also, that African god is Erinle, if you want to look that up.
Erinle, absolutely. Yeah, I love that.
But if you want to look me up, I'm on the social media everywhere under my name, TOMAS PROWER, Tomás Prower. I was about to say, you can go to a bookstore, but maybe you can go to a bookstore.
Right. Yeah.
But no, you can go online, check out the books, buy from your local if you can online. And yeah, you hit me up on social media if you want to learn more. I don't bite. Facebook's probably the best place. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. I'm trying to build those, so I don't really tweet and I don't really Instagram, but it's there.
But if you joined, you might start.
I mean, we got to start somehow.
We get a bunch of people to join, you'll be
Yeah.
But just social media. I have a website, which is my name again, TomasPrower. But yeah, if you just type in Tomás Prower to Google, you'll find some way to contact me, or you'll find some of my books and stuff. So hit me up on there. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, we've really enjoyed having you on. This was a very fun conversation,
All right. Yeah.
And we hope to have you on again. Please consider coming back on to talk about morbid magic, death, spirituality, and culture from around the world. Sounds like a fun topic as well. And thank you. You've been listening to Tomás Prower right here on The Wasteland.
Welcome to the